Thank you, Meral, and good morning, everybody. It is Canada. It is none of this 51st state bullshit. And so Trump really shot himself in the foot. He's done that between the eyes several times too, but he really shot himself in the foot with the 51st state thing. Look who you have now. Stark, is that his name? No, who's your new prime minister? Carney, the banker. Anyway, best of luck. And we're not going to have a repeat of the French and Indian Wars. Welcome to day 2 of the Love Fest. I almost feel like I'm back at Woodstock in the 60s. Some of you are old enough to remember that, but this is a wonderful 2-day commemoration of an incredible career, and pretty soon you're going to feel like you're damn Taylor Swift. And I think inside you've been near tears yesterday and last night and today. But it is a monumental tribute to a man who has touched lives all over the world through the eyes of cardiac surgeons and cardiologists who have listened. And it's been a tremendous career full of ups and downs. There's been a lot of obstacles, but you always bounce back. And as Jackie's father told you when when you asked her to marry you, your future father-in-law thought you were nuts because you were so driven. You were pathologically driven to improve this field. And he almost didn't let you marry her, right? But that, I'm not going to call it pathological, but that different degree of zeal and dedication is really unequaled. And our careers parallel themselves pretty much. I look for some old pictures of you from Curitiba and Paraná, but the federal government, police of the state of Curitiba has wiped everything clean. I think Che Guevara was about 15 years ahead of you for the Argentine position, but boy, when you two came, and then when you left Brazil, when the right-wing government took over in the coup, they just wiped it clean. So your dad, or somebody was looking after you, or the church, or something. Anyway, then to end up in Brooklyn as a surgical intern. Kings County, the surgical residents carried pistols in ankle holsters to protect themselves on the street and from some of the patients. What a welcome. And you survived. And then on to Cleveland, and then here in Toronto. We're a couple years apart, but our careers also paralleled themselves in that we early on started to challenge dogma. And that's been one of your trademarks for your entire career. Never be afraid to challenge dogma, even if it's going to piss someone off. There's nothing wrong with that. Open-mindedness, learn, investigate, prove, disprove. Well, that career and that work ethic has done you well. We started in the very late 70s, early 80s, thinking that God put the subvalvular apparatus and the mitral valve there for a reason. And most of you aren't old enough to remember, but in those days, the mitral valve replacement was about a 20-minute operation. The junior resident got to do it. You cut everything out, put in a new valve, and away you went, except the patients didn't do very well long term. So your work first in dogs, looking at the papillary muscles and the chordiotendineae, and our work subsequently in sheep and pigs opened the door to surgeons to rethink this. And the concept actually goes back to Dwight Magoon in the early 60s with Starr-Edwards ball valves. And he did save the subvalvular apparatus way back then. 20 years before we thought we had a new idea. But it took us, as you said yesterday, 20 years to convince the world that God put the mitral subvalvular apparatus there for a reason. And it was a long 20 years. But finally, the world realized that these whippersnappers might be onto something. Then in the meantime, the advantages of mitral repair and the clinical and functional improvement became obvious to us all. So that's where we started. It was a meeting in Bermuda in the early 80s. And the senior surgeons at that meeting, we were just the young bucks. They thought we were completely nuts. Why make a simple, quick, dirty operation complicated? The residents didn't like it either because a mitral valve replacement became a chief resident case, took it away from the junior resident. And that went on from there. We haven't had many differences, but we have had some. And I'll go through the history of the Tirone David valve sparing operation for one. But before that, I want to talk a bit more about the lab work. Later on, you developed with St. Jude, what became known as the Toronto valves, Toronto SPV valve. And this is a great story. It's a true story. But unfortunately, nobody can find the Toronto newspaper pictures from 1982. And Tirone started off at the Western for about 10 years. The lab was over there. And they were investigating in sheep the SPV valve, the stetless porcine valve. And it cost a lot of money, a lot of work. And one early morning, the animal rights groups in Toronto got into the animal research lab at the Western and let loose all of the research sheep. And they're running all over the streets of Toronto. And Tirone and Paul get there, and they say, what? They have all this money, all this research. And so here they are scrambling around in the streets with the police trying to capture all the lab sheep. I just wish somebody could find a picture of that. I don't know, how many did you find? Do you know? Found all the sheep. Okay, so somebody was not going to get any lamb chops, but that must have been quite a day. But you persevered. In 1988, I think you did your first valve sparing operation, published it in 92. And as we all know, that was a Tirone David 1. Why do we call it a 1? The evolution of the Tirone David valve sparing reimplantation technique operation had to be clarified. And there was some whippersnapper on the West Coast who the editor of the JTCVS asked to clarify for the readership, what is Dr. David talking about this year compared to last year or the year before? And he does change, but he always changes for a very good, legitimate, and thoughtful reason. So they asked me to write that editorial in 2001. Maybe it was 1901. Was it 2000? 1901. It was 100 years ago. Feels like 100 years ago. And we put numbers on your operation. You went from a straight cylindrical graft to a variety of a Yakub remodeling operation with the Tirone David 2 and then the 3. The 3 was just reinforcement between the trigones with an external layer of Teflon felt to prevent dilatation of the non-coronary sinus. And then a Tirone David 4 at that time was a bigger graft, neck down at the sinotubular junction, trying to recreate the sinuses, which actually was Francis Robichek's idea with Thurbikar, the engineer. That 5, which you just introduced at that time, was where you neck down, even bigger graft, necking down the bottom at the annular level and the sinotubular junction, thereby trying to create more pseudosinuses. So that's what Andy Wickler asked me to do, and we only had 5 at that time. And quite honestly, we only have 5 today. Isn't that interesting? But there have been some tweaks. So the first 10, 15 years of your experience was all a cylindrical graft. And then you said it takes time, and I don't like to waste time in the operating room, so you got tired of creating neosinuses. And people would ask you why, and you'd say, because my results are so excellent in my early experience with a tube graft, why do I need pseudosinuses? I kept telling you, the reason the results were so good in the early days with a straight tube graft was because you were so incredibly selective and picky. You've always been picky. But to the patient's benefit, you're highly selective. Very few bicuspids, very few with severe AR, very few in the early days with a giant annulus. So you gave up the pseudosinuses until the last year or two, when you realized that there are flow, hemodynamic, and probably biomechanical properties of recreating the pseudosinuses that we need to think about to improve the long-term durability of the operation. And that's been one of the sobering, unsettling things that your group here and ours has seen over the first 20 years. In patients with connective tissue disorders, particularly the Loeys-Dietz group and the Marfan group, at 20 years, the incidence of downstream type B dissection is astonishingly high. 10% of type B dissections at 20 years for Marfan patients at Stanford, 18% here in Toronto. For the Loeys-Dietz patients, it's 20% at Stanford who developed a type B dissection at 20 years. And as we all know, that's a life-altering and sometimes life-ending complication. So maybe going back to the drawing board, looking at the mechanical stresses that we're transferring downstream is indeed correct. And someday, the younger people in this audience are going to tell us. But it's really funny to see you go full circle and come back to creating neosinuses, sometimes with two grafts. And I think that's called the Stanford modification, right? But he welcomes input. He's not like President Trump. He accepts advice, and he thinks. He's always thinking, and he's thinking of the patient. So these 2 days are a grand love fest, but mostly Thanksgiving Day for the incredible number of patients you have benefited due to your hard work and your dedication over a very long career. One more quip about Tirone. When we were doing our long-term follow-up, and we can't get echoes, we know what the HMO won't pay for them, blah, blah, blah. He says the only good thing about operating in a socialized medicine country is that I can get my follow-up tests for free. Anyway, we all love you. We all admire you. We respect you. But you're not Taylor Swift.